I am Mark Bradley. I'm a professor of history here at the University of Chicago and also the co-chair of the faculty board for the Human Rights Program. I want to welcome all of you here tonight, students here at the university, faculty, the wider university and Hyde Park community, and also to acknowledge and thank the DePaul group from the law school who have come out today for the lecture. It's very nice to see you here as well. It is a real delight, however, to welcome Rodolfo Stavenhagen, who is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the Colegio in Mexico City and also the former United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms of Indigenous People, to welcome Rodolfo here to the University of Chicago. Rodolfo, no, there's more. Rodolfo is with us this quarter as the Richard and Ann Pozen Visiting Professor of Human Rights. And Richard and Ann Pozen have been exceptionally generous over the years to the Human Rights Program, funding not just this professorship, but also parts of our Human Rights Internship Program, of which I'm guessing some in the audience have been the beneficiaries of. We are deeply grateful both to Richard and Ann for their support. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Center for Latin American Studies and the Katz Center for Mexican Studies for their support of Rodolfo's visit and also of these lectures. The Pozen Professorship essentially has two components. One is, of course, teaching undergraduates and graduates on some dimension of a human rights problem, and the other giving a series of more public lectures, which is what brings us together this evening. We could have no one better suited to taking up these multiple roles than Rodolfo. In many ways, in fact, his career embodies the arc of global human rights politics in the last half of the 20th century and into the present moment. Rodolfo was, in an important sense, present at the creation. Shortly after, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which we all know as the kind of cornerstone of today's global human rights order. Rodolfo came to study as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago. And indeed, one of the first people he met when he came to campus was Eleanor Roosevelt, who just, blew in for one of her many visits to campus. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the seminal figures in the passage of the Declaration. Shortly thereafter, he was rubbing elbows with W.E.B. Du Bois and Ralph Bunche, both critical players in human rights politics in this country and globally in the 1940s. And so what better way to launch a career on human rights? And it seems to me particularly lovely to come back full circle this spring to Chicago. Rodolfo's distinguished career, in a way, exemplifies the deepening and thickening of human rights talk and practice in the 6 decades since the Universal Declaration was signed. And indeed, as a scholar and a practitioner, he's played a critical role in expanding the human rights lexicon to include the rights of indigenous peoples. He is the author of more than 12 books, along with chapters and reviews and articles that are too numerous to count, that explore in very powerful ways indigenous peoples and human rights, ethnic conflict, agrarian problems, and social development. Along with the Colegio, Rodolfo has taught at Harvard, at Stanford, and at universities in Paris, Seville, Geneva, and in Rio. He is also that rare scholar who moves seamlessly between the worlds of the academy and politics. And in his work in the political realm, Rodolfo illustrates the critical role of non-state actors, both the United Nations and the NGO world, along with states, in forging and enlarging a global human rights imagination. He was a founding member and president of Mexico's first human rights NGO, the Mexican Human Rights Academy, and served on the Governmental Human Rights Commission. At the United Nations, he was Assistant Director General for the Social Sciences at UNESCO, as well as UN Special Rapporteur for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 2001 to 2008. He's been called as an expert witness by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. He's served on the boards of many NGOs and has advised intergovernmental bodies, NGOs, and foundations on the rights of the indigenous in Latin America and beyond. I think it's fair to say Rodolfo keeps himself busy. Tonight, he begins a series of 3 lectures around the larger theme of human rights and indigenous peoples in the new millennium. And we invite you to return next Wednesday, April 13th, same time, same place, for part 2, essentially an exploration of the simultaneous rise of anti-colonialism and indigenous rights claims. And the following Wednesday, April 20th, the final lecture, when, among other things, Rodolfo promises to tell all, in I think best tabloid style, about what it really means to be a special rapporteur at the United Nations. Tonight, his lecture is titled, Our Universal Human Rights for Everybody, the Nation State and the Vanishing Indians. Again, a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Hello, good afternoon, good evening. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. I almost didn't recognize myself. Where did you pick up all that information? And I thank Susan Zesch as well for the invitation to be here. Otherwise, I wouldn't have come to the University of Chicago. I'm really very happy to be back here 60 years after graduating from the college, right around here. Some of you in this room will do that very soon. For me, it was a fabulous experience, and I remember it very well today, and it actually has to do with defining some of my interests in my professional and academic career, not only because I had the great pleasure, first of all, to obtain a BA after a 2 years liberal BA course that was then in fashion here at this university under the guidance of the Chancellor Robert Hutchins, whom I also got to meet, but also because I met these persons involved in the human rights world at the time, Eleanor Roosevelt, Ralph Bunche, W.E.B. Du Bois, whom I listened to at some of the conference halls here and had small seminars with other students. So all of that comes back to me now. And it defined me also, not only because I was able to meet and learn from these wonderful people who were here at Chicago at the time, but also because in the Anthro department, I was a student for a while of Robert Redfield, who had done field work in Mexico, and Sol Tax, great anthropologists of the University of Chicago, who had done field work in Guatemala and also in Mexico, and some of their former students in Mexico who were friends of the family. I'll tell you all the stories. They said, when you go to Chicago, go and say hello to Robert Redfield. I had not heard of Robert Redfield before, but I asked him for permission to audit his course, which he very kindly conceded. It was a very complex course because it was a graduate course for anthropology majors, and I was just an undergraduate, just arriving at the college. But listening to Robert Redfield taught me a lot about my own country, because Robert Redfield had done field work in Mexico from the 1920s onward, as some of you may know, in Yucatan, in a place called Tepoztlan, which is a little village where I have a little house, which I sometimes use with my family, and which was studied, the village, by Robert Redfield. So when I returned to Mexico, after graduating here in Chicago, I decided I wanted to become an anthropologist. And so I studied anthropology in Mexico, and that brought me together with some of the people that Robert Redfield and Sol Tax had been working with several years before, the indigenous peoples of Mexico, and that got me started on my career. And so here I am 60 years later telling you about indigenous peoples in the world and human rights, all of which started while I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago between 1949 and 1951. It's hard to believe, isn't it? I can't believe it myself, but here I am again. So in preparation for this lecture, as Susan had asked me to, I prepared a manuscript of about 30 pages, single-spaced, which I was going to read. After all, this is an academic university, so you have to be very careful what you read. But then I decided it's not an academic seminar, It's not a conference, it's not a paper for a publication, so I left it in my computer, and I just jotted down some ideas which I want to share with you today. In Mexico and in some other countries on this continent, last year, 2010, was a very important year because in many countries there were celebrations on the 200th anniversary, the second centennial of the beginning of the struggle for national independence. In Mexico and all the way south, particularly, you have heard of these struggles for independence. You've heard of Simón Bolívar, you've heard of Padre Hidalgo, Miguel Hidalgo, and José María Morelos, who struggled for independence in Mexico. And the Spanish Empire cracked and fragmented, fell to pieces, and instead of that, there were eventually over 20 independent countries, republics, that were set up for independent life, following a bit upon the example which a few years before had been given by the 13 colonies in North America and the establishment of the independence of the United States. So in that sense, we were very modern at the beginning of the 19th century, inspired by the French Revolution, inspired by the liberalism of Western Europe, particularly the United Kingdom, inspired by the laws, the Napoleonic laws of the beginning of the 19th century, and of course, inspired by the Constitution of the United States, the Bill of Rights, and the struggle of these 13 colonies to become a major world power within a few generations. In Mexico, as elsewhere, there was this transformation which was now being celebrated in the year 2010, after 200 years, with great and much ado, as all these celebrations do. I had the fortune, or the circumstance, to have been asked to join a commission, an advisory commission to the government of Mexico last year, to advise with other people, academics, historians, and so forth, on what should we do to celebrate the second centennial of Mexico's independence. What should the state do? What should the academic institutions do? What should the media do? And so forth. And I attended any number of meetings over the months of 2010. And to my surprise, everybody suggested activities, publications, public events, ceremonials, etc., etc., etc. Nobody mentioned indigenous peoples of Mexico. Somehow, the centennial celebrations were in the hands of the elites, of the decision makers, of those who had always decided about Mexico's independence and what came later in those 200 years of Republican life of the country of Mexico. And from my knowledge, similar things happened in other parts of Latin America, where also such commissions were set up to prepare the country for these great celebrations. The great celebrations were held, and indigenous peoples were not present, as they were not present at the beginning of the independence, at the beginning of the 19th century. And I remember last year, several times at these meetings, I asked for the floor and said, shouldn't we do something about the participation of indigenous peoples in the history of Mexico? And everybody said, yes, how interesting. And then they went around and did what they had planned to do anyway. And at the last meeting, it was towards the end of last year, when many of these celebrations, publications had already taken place, and perhaps every now and then there was a brief reference to, oh yes, Mexico at the beginning of the 19th century was full of Indians, wasn't it? You know, and that's where it stood. And then at the last meeting, I said, you know, for all this year I've been asking this commission to do something for indigenous peoples and about the role of indigenous peoples in the history of this country ever since before the independence, of course, and yet we aren't doing anything about that. And I'm really very sad about it, and so are the indigenous peoples of Mexico, who, of course, had expressed some of their desires in that sense. And at that last meeting, there was present the Federal Minister of Education, the Secretary of Education of the country. And he heard me out, and then he said, come and talk to me. What do you have in mind? And so I said, well, we should do something as a country, as a society, as a culture, about indigenous peoples. So he said, yes, let's do that. And that's when they came on the agenda, towards the very end of last year's celebration. It wasn't big. We simply organized a TV series of about 10 programs because we didn't have many resources, we didn't have much time, where we were able to invite indigenous representatives from different walks of life, but particularly people who were struggling for their rights, who were active in the field of education, in local politics, in linguistic policy, in health problems, social services, and so forth, and who had a clearer view of what really ailed and ails indigenous peoples in Mexico. And so we had this program, and from what I hear from the people who organized, the producers, it was quite successful, and I suppose you can download it from YouTube. And finally, indigenous peoples were present in the media because of this television program. Why am I telling that? Because the whole history of the independent countries of Latin America has been an ignorance of indigenous peoples and their role in the making of the modern country, in the making of modern society. And in a country which was conquered by Hernan Cortés, as you know, over 500 years ago, and which remained demographically being mostly Indian in its ethnic makeup, all up to the very end of the 19th century or even the beginning of the 20th century, when, of course, Mexico had a second great upheaval, which was the Mexican Revolution. I don't need to tell you about that because we have the Mexican CATS, Mexican Studies Center, right next door here, which has devoted itself to a study of the Mexican Revolution for many decades under the guidance of Professor Friedrich Katz, whom we miss very much tonight. I certainly do, because he was a personal friend of mine ever since childhood. So, but for Mexico, the centennial of the revolution and the bicentennial of independence was very important. And the indigenous peoples, who were the basic demographic component of the Mexican population from long and way back, hardly appeared in these celebrations. Now, this not only happened in Mexico. This happened in all the other countries of Latin America. And if we go beyond Latin America, it also happened here in the United States. It also happened further north in Canada. And outside of the Americas, it has happened wherever indigenous peoples have encountered the national state. So when we talk about indigenous peoples, which we now do at the Human Rights Program, and which is the purpose of my visit to this campus this time, to raise these issues and talk about these issues with our students, when we talk about these issues, we need to recognize that one of the major violations of the human rights of indigenous peoples around the world has been precisely their conflictive relationship with the existing states. There are no human rights of indigenous peoples that can be studied, analyzed, understood all over the world unless it is in their relationship with the wider society, which is particularly the way this wider society works through the institutions of the state, of the national state, which is an invention of Western Europe, say earlier on, but particularly during the 19th century and up to the present time, and which is a model of political organization that has been that has expanded throughout the world. And now, of course, we relate this model of the state and its political organization with the concept of democracy, with the concept of citizenship, with the concept of human rights, with the concept of participation in the polity, in the society, in the decision-making process. And again and again and again, we find that somehow or other, indigenous peoples, or so-called indigenous peoples, or the peoples that on this continent received the name of Indians, and we all know where that came from, but these peoples who were conquered, who were settled, who were colonized, who were, in a way, destroyed as independent societies long before the emergence of the modern state. The modern state has not liberated indigenous peoples yet, despite the rhetoric of democracy, the rhetoric of human rights, the rhetoric of equal rights, the rhetoric of participation. And that is one of the major concerns in the world today when we speak about the universality of human rights. Because when we look at the history of indigenous peoples, we see that there have been limits to the universality of human rights, that there always have been people around the world who have not been able to enjoy their human rights. And among these peoples, not the only ones, mind you, but I'm not speaking about the whole world or all minorities or all ethnically distinct peoples. In this case, my concern is only with peoples who we identify as indigenous peoples around the world. These peoples have been excluded from full participation in the polity and in the society. And it's not just one case or two cases. It's not just that somebody at a street corner, for example, as we see in the streets of Winnipeg, or we see in the streets of Lima, or we see in the streets of Santiago de Chile, or so forth, not only because some peoples are like outcasts, or are the socially excluded, are the marginalized, are the discriminated against, and need some help or protection as individuals. That is one way to look at it. And that is what we have been educated to look at. How individuals are always in some way or can be excluded by the workings of the system. But what we see with indigenous peoples is that it is not only isolated individuals who somehow or other couldn't make it in the rat race or couldn't make it in any other kind of participation, but we see entire peoples, entire communities, simply because they are classified or named as indigenous peoples who are so excluded and marginalized and discriminated against and subject to the decisions by others, etc., etc. It is really amazing that at the time of the celebrations of the bicentenary of our independences, I'm speaking of Latin America, obviously in other parts of the world the story may be a little bit different, but it is amazing that in the official celebrations, just as in the official history books, just as in the official democratic rhetoric, just as in the dominant legal system or constitutional arrangements in any one of these countries, indigenous peoples have been systematically ignored. This is the history of the 19th century in Latin America, as I said, from the creation of the states to the present time. This has been the history in many other countries, and I venture to say it is also the history of those countries in other parts of the world that have achieved their independence more recently in the so-called process of decolonization from the world empires, which only occurred in many parts of the world, as we all know, since the end of the Second World War, since precisely the adoption of that Universal Declaration of Human Rights that I heard about probably for the first time or almost when Eleanor Roosevelt came to speak on this campus, and I was among the students listening to what she had to say. It was at that time that the plight of excluded, marginalized people also came to be known by the founders of the United Nations and by the United Nations itself as an organization. And throughout these years, from 1945 onward, indigenous peoples, within the framework of a wider conception of human rights, also became part of the concerns of this vast new international organization that had begun its activities at the end of the Second World War in order to create a new world, a better world with opportunities for everybody, and so on and so forth. And it is within that framework that we know that the colonies of the British Empire, of the French Empire, of the Dutch Empire, of the Portuguese Empire, and so forth, were able to achieve their independence through the process guided by the UN, approved of by the members of the Security Council of the UN, who are the real owners of the UN, the states, the big states, the great powers, who decided, and Franklin Roosevelt, of course, was one of them, that colonization had to end. And this was something that even President Wilson had begun to speak about at the end of the First World War. So there was a history to what is now called the right of nations to self-determination, which is another aspect that, at least in my class, we'll come to eventually, but maybe not this evening here. But anyway, I want to give a little bit of background because it is within the framework of this debate amongst the powers of what should happen to peoples who had lived in multinational empires, who had been colonies of other nations, when democracy comes around, when independence comes around, when freedoms comes around. And that is why the United Nations, next to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, decided to adopt, almost 2 decades later, the International Human Rights Covenants. 1966 is the year the UN adopted the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the International Convention of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in order to implement the great principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. What was the difference between the Declaration and these two covenants 18 years later? The difference was mainly, of course, as all of you know, that a covenant is an international treaty, and when ratified by a state, it is supposed to be law of that state and has to be complied with and implemented by that very same state. Whereas an earlier declaration is simply what it says, a declaration of principles, of hopes, of aspirations. Well, human rights in the UN system became from a hope and an aspiration towards the future, became international law through these two covenants. And the first articles, Article 1 of each one of the covenants, read alike and says all peoples have the right to self-determination. What did that mean in the UN parlance? It meant that now there was a law recognizing the right of peoples in the colonies to establish their independence, to establish their freedom, which the United States had done by itself long before, and which the Latin American countries had also done at the beginning of the 19th century. What is important about this? What is important is that the United Nations came on record at the time that peoples everywhere who live under the domination of other powers or states or empires, usually across the seas, which was the so-called blue water principle of the rights of peoples, which was established by the UN, giving the peoples in colonial situations the right to become independent. And that is where the concept of indigenous peoples sort of came to the United Nations, very slowly, because who were the peoples in the colonies? For the empires. The people in the British colonies around the world, the people in the French colonies around the world, the people in the Portuguese colonies in Africa, for example. Well, these were the native peoples of these particular countries. At that time, in international legal parlance and in political parlance, these people were referred to as the indigenes, or the aboriginals, or the autochtones, as they would say in French, or simply the natives in these countries. And what happened when these countries became independent? Well, then the natives became independent, and they became citizens of their respective countries, which is what we thought in Latin America had actually happened at the beginning of the 19th century. But then it turns out that things are never so simple as they look, and things never turn out as clearly as the framers of these international documents and these great principles had really thought about. It turned out that in many of these countries, particularly on the American continent, but also in countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and a number of others, which we call settler societies. It turns out that not all of the people who become independent are really and clearly the indigenous peoples of these countries. So the concept indigenous now began to be referred to certain differentials within independent countries. What are these differentials? Well, that's a long argument. That's not yet over. But certainly the idea of prior occupancy is very important. You know, we were here before. We were here before the colonizers came, before the conquistadors, before the settlers came around. Not only we were here before, but we have rights to being recognized as having a special and distinct status in these modern states, which, by the way, we never recognized. These states came along and took our lands, and suddenly they said, we are the owners of this country. We give it its characteristics, but they never asked us about it. So the second characteristic is that indigenous peoples are not the willing participants in the founding of the states of which they now are a part. And this is an argument that came to the United Nations. And indigenous representatives came to the UN and said, look, you have just decolonized Africa. You guys have just decolonized a lot of former colonies in South Asia, in Pacific Islands, in the Caribbean, you name it, and there was a colony of the United Kingdom, of Great Britain, or a French colony or Dutch colony somewhere around. So now they're all independent. But the argument went at the UN with indigenous peoples, we were here before, we weren't asked about it, it isn't our state at all, and we are culturally distinct, we don't accept all of this, what the colonizers and the settlers and the new states are telling us, and we want our rights. And then people began really investigating about what had happened to indigenous peoples since the Declaration of Independence. Let's put it that way, because it happened here in the United States. Who declared independence? Well, you know it. I don't have to tell you. Were the American Indians involved? No, not as Indians. They weren't even recognized as that. There are all sorts of things that happened here and happened in Canada with treaties and court cases and so forth. But in Latin America, for example, in Mexico and elsewhere, the people who achieved their independence from the Spanish Empire were the Spaniards themselves, the criollos, as we call them there, who had become independent who had been the descendants of some of the conquistadors, had been born in the colony, in New Spain in one case, in Peru in another case, in what then became Chile or Argentina, what we call the southern cone of this continent, in yet another case, and they became the new governing class, the new governing elite of these particular countries. And the Indians, as I said earlier, were excluded. And this same thing happened in recent years, much more recently, in our lifetime, since the United Nations took charge of that or began discussing these issues. It's happened in countries like India, Southeast Asia, Africa, not only South Africa, but also other African countries, where the population can now be considered as consisting also of a divided, demographically, ethnically divided countries with indigenous peoples within the nation state. So the human rights issue came about more recently into public domain, discussions within countries, constitutional reforms, legislative reforms in other countries, indigenous movements, social movements, and political movements for human rights, and negotiations between indigenous peoples and national governments, whether they are republics, whether they are federations, whether they are single unitary states, and so forth. All over the world, indigenous peoples have begun to ask for their rights, to press for their rights as peoples, arguing not only as individuals, as I said earlier, but as peoples, as communities, as distinct nations. And this has now been taken up by the United Nations within its human rights framework, because, you know, the UN has different interests, you know, keeping the peace, fostering development, and so on and so forth. And one of the big areas in the UN is fostering human rights. And that's why we have a declaration. That's why we have these covenants. That's why we have other treaties and declarations on the rights of women, on the rights of children, on the rights of migrant workers, on the rights of disabled persons, and so forth. And the latest addition to this panoply of international law that's in the making at the United Nations is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted by the General Assembly of the UN in September of the year 2007. That is less than 4 years old. And it is now an international legal instrument for the defense of and the protection of the human rights of indigenous peoples. So the whole arguments about human rights has shifted in the last few years. Not that the classic traditional human rights of the individual, the freedom of individuals, not that that has disappeared. No, that is still the founding principle of the human rights discourse all over the world. And we still, of course, as we all know, have governments that don't want to comply, that don't want to implement, that don't want to recognize individual human rights. Okay, but next to individual human rights, we have an emerging international system, and which is also being discussed locally, domestically, in a number of countries, of the collective rights of indigenous peoples. Their right to continue to be what they want to be as a people. And their founding document is Article 1 of the 2 international human rights covenants. It's not something that indigenous peoples have invented all by themselves, though of course they have been very active, increasingly active, at these various levels of debates. They go to the courts, they use the media, they have their NGOs, they elect their politicians to parliament or as mayors of their communities, and at least in one case, here on the continent, they have finally elected a president of the republic, who is Evo Morales, an Aymara Indian from Bolivia. And the first thing that Evo Morales did when he achieved power in Bolivia back in the year 2005 was to abolish the government department of Indian Affairs. Why? Because he felt that this was a way to discriminate and to ghettoize, the word spread around, to ghettoize the Indians of Bolivia in a special government department, when in fact they were the majority and are the majority of the population who brought Evo Morales to power in the first place. And the second thing that Evo Morales did, and his party and his sympathizers, was to modify the Constitution. Actually, we were there during one of the sessions of the Constitutional Assembly. It was fascinating to see how this Constitutional Assembly was actually working. Some people were saying, well, it isn't working, that's the problem, you know. It's too complicated. There's a lot of discussion, but where is the change? Well, the change came about. They proposed a new constitution, which was then ratified by popular vote. So Bolivia has a new constitution, and it now calls itself a plurinational state. That's the legal concept of Bolivia, is not an independent republic as used to be at the beginning of the 19th century. It's now a plurinational state with all of the implications of how we go about interpreting a plurinational state. But that's too complex to raise here, and I'm running out of time. So what I'm trying to say is that there has been a movement from a traditional concept of the nation state, with which so many states in the world were born to independence only within the last 200 years, or much less in some cases. And there has been a shift beyond the traditional concept of universal individual human rights as being the basis of a modern democratic state. I'm not saying that it isn't, but I'm saying that what we're seeing is something that goes beyond the traditional way of looking at things. And indigenous peoples are at the center of these debates and have been for the last 20 or 25 years. Certainly when I was an undergrad student in the college here at the University of Chicago, nobody talked about this. On the contrary, the debate went the other way. What I learned from my professors Robert Redfield and Sol Tax here in the Anthro department at the time was that anthropologists should be socially responsible, should do something for the people they study from afar, from outside. And at that time, the difference between an anthropologist and a sociologist, was that an anthropologist looks at the society from outside, and a sociologist looks at the society from within, because he or she are a part of that society, so they study themselves. Anthropologists study the other. And the concept of the other, well, obviously, was applied to the Indians, was applied to the natives, to the autochthone, The best anthropologist ever at that time was a woman called Margaret Mead. We've all read her at some point. She went to an island in the Pacific. She stayed there for years. She wrote fabulous books. And then her critics came along a generation later saying she didn't understand anything because she was an outsider. She looked from outside. And the Samoans themselves, or the Fijians and others, they now say anthropologists don't understand anything because they're not part of the society. They don't understand the culture from inside. Well, that's a side argument. It distracts a little bit from what I'm trying to say here. But it's there. The argument is there. And I know anthropologists at academic meetings, what they do now, I never learned to do that, but what they do now is they introduce themselves and place themselves with respect to the other organizations, and saying, I'll tell you from what vantage point I'm giving you my lecture. Well, I almost did the same thing this evening here. So there is something about personal identification and the identification of others. And in the human rights field, that is exactly what we see daily, what we see on an everyday basis. So the indigenous peoples have come to the UN, and they have come to other international organizations. They have come to the Organization of American States. Just today there is a press bulletin from the Commission, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, which is a part of the Organization of American States, our regional, continental American political organization. And this commission has now set out a bulletin, or published a bulletin only yesterday, advising the government of Brazil that it should not pursue in building a giant dam right in the middle of the Amazon, because that dam will violate the rights of the indigenous peoples who live in that little part of the Amazon. And not only that, but beyond that, it will also tend to help destroy the environment. And the people in the world, of course, are nowadays much more concerned with the environment than they actually are with the human rights of indigenous peoples. But these two concepts are very closely linked. And wherever you have violations of human rights of indigenous peoples, in 90% of the cases, they relate to violations of the rights of the environment, because the environment is now considered in international law by the UN itself and so many international conferences as a subject and a bearer of rights. The environment has human rights. Can you imagine? 25 years ago, nobody would have said that. Now it is part of the international legal language. And native peoples, Native Americans or Native Indians out in India, or Native Africans in the Sahara or in in the Kalahari Desert or elsewhere, they are very conscious of the relationship between their own survival and the survival of the environment, between their own rights and the planetary rights of humanity to a clear environment, to a safe environment, to a continuing environment. Because one of the dangers, as Lester Brown has said in his books only recently, is that we are destroying civilization by destroying the planet. And we have very little time left. And the people who feel this most of all are the indigenous peoples. Whether it's up in the Arctic, or whether it's in the Amazon jungle, or whether it's in the deserts of Central Africa or East Africa or Northern Africa, or whether it is in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines. It's incredible. Let me finish by saying simply, telling you a story. I was on one of my first missions as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to the Philippines. And the government was in charge of organizing my trip, and some NGOs were helping along, saying, you know, we want you to see this community, we want you to talk to those people. So one of the side trips, or well, trips of the mission, was the extreme north, the northern island of Luzon in the Philippines. It was very difficult to get there. There was a small country road, mountain road, that went higher and higher and higher. I was told it had been built during the Second World War by Army engineers of the American government in order to protect the Philippines from the coming invasion by Japan. So they built this road. We took that little road, which was still in the state it had probably been 50 years before, and we arrived at a small village, and just the last one on that road. And just as we turned the last bend in the road, there was this little village of small number of huts of the Igorot people in northern Luzon, and stretched between two trees, there was a big sign, hand-painted, saying, "Welcome human rights." So you can imagine what I felt like, you know, being there, coming from the UN, all this long travel, and being welcomed as the embodiment of human rights for a small group of villagers in northern Luzon who had put their hopes on the United Nations, just as the world had put its hopes on the United Nations 50 years before at the founding of the UN and the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that is where we have to link our knowledge of human rights with the way that nation states have become organized themselves to exclude indigenous peoples from their concept of the polis, their concept of the political society, their territorial organization of their states, the legal system, the political rhetoric. One of the great political mistakes that I think national states have made is that we all need one state, one language, one religion, one territory, one culture. So anybody who doesn't comply with these criteria is a traitor to the nation, is a stranger to the nation, is a barbarian, a savage, or whatever. And indigenous peoples fit that definition perfectly. And indigenous peoples in most of the national states that I have been able to visit as a UN mandate holder, or simply as a social scientist interest, or as a concerned citizen like in Mexico working with indigenous peoples, one of the major, not the only one, but one of the major agents or actors violating the rights of indigenous peoples as individuals as well as groups, collectivities, communities, has been precisely the nation state. The policies of the nation state with regard to indigenous peoples has been highly destructive of indigenous peoples. Whether it's in Canada, in the United States, in Mexico, in Guatemala, we can go all the way down to southern Chile and southern Argentina, and we can look at other countries around the world where we find exactly the same thing. So I'll just leave it at that. And I guess, Susan, we can entertain questions and maybe answers. I don't know. Thank you. Yes, sir.
So, you talked about how discourse surrounding indigenous peoples is shifting the traditional notion of what the nation state means and how we imagine that. And it strikes me that in this era that we refer to under the general moniker of globalization, another social phenomenon that is shifting the traditional notion of the nation state is migration. And it also strikes me that in recent years there has been an increase in indigenous migration from Mexico to the United States. And so I wonder if you could speculate about the future of indigenous migration and the human rights implications of what that might mean in terms of citizenship, in terms of human rights discourse.
A complex issue, and you pose it very well and very rightly so. And this migration has not only increased from Mexico to the United States, but from Guatemala, Salvador, Central America to the United States, from Ecuador and Peru and Bolivia to the United States, and not only to the United States, to Canada and even to Europe under certain circumstances. So the indigenous component of the migration phenomenon, that's there. And it has human rights implications. I don't know how well you know the story of the Central American migrants when they travel on top of trains on the containers trying to reach paradise, across the border into the United States. Many of them don't speak Spanish. Many of them are adolescents, are children who are sent out by their parents, go and try to make it. And many of them leave their lives there because of the organized crime and the violence along the way and the corruption of the authorities throughout the way from the southern border of Mexico to whatever entry point they can find on the southern border of the United States. So these are particular issues. I remember a couple of years ago or so where I gave a talk to some government officials in Mexico, and I mentioned the increasing presence of indigenous persons, members of indigenous communities, in this flow of migrants. And an official from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs came to me and said, "Do you have any information about that? Because we don't have any information about that." So it's very difficult to get information, you know. I didn't have any information at that point, no statistics, nothing I could show this person from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But the Mexican government dealing with foreign affairs didn't have an inkling of what was happened at that time. Maybe now it has more than an inkling, but maybe a drop more. But that's about as far as it goes. But these are the issues that have to be dealt with. And not only dealt with policy-wise, but they have to be understood by academics. They have to be understood by scholars, by researchers, and analyzed within the context of these changing or shifting relationships. Now, what you also said is that the state has not only changed or is changing somewhat its policies, its rhetoric, its image, etc., with regard to indigenous populations. But indigenous populations are changing as well. We still have the old anthropological approach that I learned here on campus from Robert Redfield, who several years before had done a number of community studies in Yucatan. I don't know if you've read his book, famous, The Folk Culture of Yucatan, where he studies, I think, 3 or 4 communities from more primitive or simple to more urbanized. And then he drew the folk-urban continuum. you know, which was a model for many generations of anthropologists around the world, you know. You start off with an indigenous community that's isolated, that is traditional in every sense of the word, and somebody from that indigenous community moves to the next town or moves to the capital city of the state, of the province, you know, or of the department, wherever they happen to be. And then after a while, you know, they become urbanized. And that is modernization, so it's good. You know, if you modernize, it's good. If you become urbanized, it's supposed to be very good because you become more free, you become more prosperous, you have more individual opportunities and chances and so forth. It doesn't always work out that way. But that's the model that we work with. And that's a model that is still the national state model. The idea we have to develop policies that will help indigenous people to become from backward people in a way, you know, modern people, you know, from archaic societies, traditional societies, to modern societies. That's one part. And it's difficult to address, even for government policy makers. I've been involved in that for many, many decades, and still now, you know, the government people don't know exactly how to handle this process. And the indigenous peoples themselves aren't exactly sure what's happening, you know. They still stick in one way, you know, to the model of their ancestors. And you hear that in the language, you know, what we learned from our grandparents, from our parents, you know, the life in the community which is being destroyed. Somehow we want to hold on to it. But it's very difficult to hold on to it not only in a modern nation state, but you said the word a while ago, in a globalized world, because that's the other pressure. Globalization is terribly destructive of communities, of individuals, of migrants, of indigenous peoples, of you name it, you know. Globalization means a lot of things to a lot of people. But indigenous peoples, but also as individuals, sometimes simply as persons who are looking for a way out from poverty, a way out from environmental destruction, you know, an opportunity to get ahead in their lives, you know, they have to do that within a globalized environment, where even the nation state is no longer the owner of the show, certainly not in my part of the world. You know, the nation state has become more and more a figment of our imagination. You know, now we live in a multi-global, multi-dimensional, globalized world. So people ask themselves, well, what about indigenous communities? What about indigenous people within that framework? Well, I don't have the answer. That's why I said before, don't ask too many questions because I won't have the answer. But it's certainly a question to be dealt with. Yeah, the gentleman in the back there, and then two more people here. Yes.
First of all, thank you for that utterly lucid and engaging talk. I'm really happy you didn't read from a 30-page paper. I wonder how you would react to the proposition that indigenous peoples were better off living in multinational empires than living under modern nation states. And it seems to me that you yourself, towards the end of your talk, drew the obvious implication to explain why nation states haven't been recognizing indigenous peoples. Because if all peoples have a right to self-determination, then these indigenous peoples are nations within nations, and they are not essentially following the ground rules of the nation state, which is that the state grants rights to citizens as individuals. And there's a deep suspicion within that concept of the modern nation state for any parochial identifications which would subvert your identification with the state. So it seems to me utterly obvious that you're not going to have a recognition of indigenous peoples in the modern nation state because it's a kind of fifth column. It's essentially violating the very foundation of citizen-state relationship. And you essentially said that, I think, towards the end. At least I would say that. Mm-hmm. Now, it seems to me that if you believe that, then there are two implications. One, you have to expect the nation state to reduce its power. That is, strong states have to become weak states so that they're not reaching into these indigenous groups and telling them that they have to abide by rules of general application to everyone. Because if you do that, that's a destruction of the distinctiveness of these local groups. And it also seems to me that the UN has to stop acting like it can write definitions of what a normal family life is like, or how marriage should be arranged. Because it seems to me the UN
overwhelmingly, despite what you're saying about this new interest in indigenous rights, is very much involved in the globalization process, in which it's suspicious of the way those indigenous groups deal with gender, raise their children, think about marriage and inheritance. So I'd like to hear whether or not you actually are worried about UN activity in that area, and whether you have an expectation that the states are now going to become federations and give up central control, because that seems to me to be the return to the political arrangements of multicultural, multinational empire.
Wow. That is a difficult point to address. And I think you set it out very clearly, very rightly. That is certainly a major argument today at many levels concerning the reconfiguration, if at all, or the structure of the nation state in modern times. And it is being addressed in various ways, and not necessarily by the United Nations. It's being addressed internally, domestically, by members of these states themselves, through legislation, through parliamentary debates, through political platforms of political parties, and negotiations among different interest groups, and so forth. Certainly, federations, I think, are better poised at the present time to deal with these issues, these challenges of multiculturalism that occurs within their borders, not only regarding indigenous peoples, but also increasingly with other kinds of ethnic, cultural, linguistic, religious groups that sometimes are minorities and sometimes they are majorities or close to majorities, and who challenge the traditional concept of the 19th century nation state that I mentioned before, you know, one land, one territory, one state, one legal system, one language, one religion, etc., etc. This has come to a crisis, this conception. But the debates are obviously there. And in one case, they may, in fact, lead to a dismal panorama, which you mentioned, you know, conflicts, parochialism, intolerance, and a lot of people are rightly afraid of this, and in some cases this is what's in fact happening. In other cases, people see this as a great opportunity to rework our human relationships, and our relationships between human beings of different cultures, different language, different beliefs, and so on and so forth, and the environment, and the state as a structure trying to bring all of that together. And that's why you have these debates among political philosophers on the concept of multicultural citizenship, which, for example, is something that has been officially considered in Canada and is part of the of policy there. It has not been considered in the United States politically wise, but of course we all know that the United States is a multicultural society and is respectful of the rights of individuals to be multicultural, even if it has not debated this at the political level. Other countries debate this at length within their own structures, New Zealand being one of them, for example, among them, South Africa being another, Spain being another, though the word indigenous in Spain is only applied to the former colonies in the Americas, rather than within Spain itself, though I have colleagues in the field of anthropology, at least one region in Spain, Andalusia, who consider themselves to be indigenous peoples in Spain and who don't accept the traditional dominance of Castile and central Spain over Andalusia. And this happens in a number of other countries as well. So the debate of whether you can reorganize a society taking into account the differences, well, as I said earlier, Evo Morales tried it, or has tried it, and is trying it in Bolivia at the present time by a constitutional arrangement which is now called Bolivia is a multinational state. Now, exactly what is meant by that, not even the Bolivians know, and certainly not the anthropologists. There are different perspectives from which you start. When you began speaking, I thought, well, you're starting from the perspective of the state, how to keep the state, you know, as a good thing for humanity and for the people. Well, the other starting point might be, how about human rights? Regardless of the state, let's leave that outside. What are the human rights? How can they best be protected? And then we come back to the state. We say, well, a state should protect all the human rights of everybody. And so we come into this argument of what rights are legitimate rights, what rights are not legitimate. In our human rights perspective, all rights defined as such, as human rights, should be legitimate. Who is to decide? Certainly not the United Nations, about, what rights should be protected, what rights should not be protected, and so on and so forth. But you obviously opened the door to a very, very important and complicated discussion and controversial issues that have not been solved at the world level yet, and which are part of our changing global environment. Let's see, I had somebody here, and somebody there, and then you. Okay? Yes?
You already started talking about the problems of classification, maybe indigenous identity. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you see that the designation has changed over time, maybe some problems you might see with the way that groups are classified as indigenous and what that means for the percentages that are counted as indigenous in that population, and how that affects rights that are given, that recognition that the group exists at all.
Well, certainly the issue of classification is extremely important and is one of the sticking points in these whole arguments. Like Foucault said many years ago, just by naming an object, you've already given it a personality, an identity, and so forth, which may not correspond to what this object, whether it's a human being, a social group, a nation, or an institution, or anything else, really should be considered. So with indigenous peoples, that's exactly what's happening. There are many definitions. My first report as human rights rapporteur to the General Assembly of the UN I included a couple of paragraphs on the issue of definitions, because unless we start with that, it will be very difficult to find any common ground and any agreement on it. Now, in some countries, for a long time, what you had is colonial definitions, The indigenous peoples are the ones who were here and the ones we conquered, Speaking for the empire, they're the natives, and then they're us. And there's a segregation, you've seen the pictures of Forster's novels about India, the whites sitting in one place and the Indians sitting in another. That happened all over the world, and it's still happening in many parts of the world. So there are racial classifications. There are legal classifications, as there are in the United States. The one drop of blood principle, deciding who is an Indian, who is not an Indian, or 1/8. If one of your ancestors was an Indian, then you can claim to be an Indian, or you're categorized by others to be an Indian. Or you have strictly legal definitions set out by law, like in Canada, or you have cultural definitions, linguistic definitions, as set out by anthropologists, for example, in all of Latin America. Does a person speak a mother tongue which is an indigenous language, that is, which is originally from before the conquest, like speaking Quechua or Aymara or Maya or Aztec or Nahuatl or whatever? Well, then it's a good way to classify. But of course, within a changing society and a changing state, lots of indigenous peoples have lost the use of their languages or don't speak it, so they don't register themselves when the census taker comes along. Also for status reasons and others, they say, oh no, my mother tongue is Spanish, even though they can hardly speak it. It does happen. I've seen it happen, And so you get a distorted view of the distribution of who is indigenous and who is not indigenous in many countries. In many of the African countries, after colonization, the people are saying, well, here everybody is indigenous. Don't come and shake us all up, because we're all the same. We were all colonized, and so now we are all citizens of independent countries, and all of us are indigenous. I have been told that several times by African diplomats and African government officials, saying, why are you here? We're all indigenous. What are you looking at? And yet the African Union itself, the Organization of African States, has set up a commission of it calls itself the Commission on Human and People's Rights. And this commission has set up a subcommission that is looking into the definition of indigenous peoples in Africa. And it has come out with a number of very interesting reports saying, yes, we have indigenous peoples, yes, their situation is similar to that of indigenous peoples in other parts of the world. Yes, we require to have government policies addressing the particular circumstances of indigenous peoples. Yes, they suffer from human rights violations, just as indigenous peoples all over the world, both in an individual sense and in a community sense of human rights. So we have this going on around the world in different parts. But the question of definition classification is obviously one that every country or every people that think it applies have to be very clear about what they mean in that sense. Anybody else here? Somebody here? Yes, back there. And then we move down here. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you could comment on the role of the Zapatistas in safeguarding indigenous rights in Chiapas and its role in working with the nation-state of Mexico in the future of that.
Well, as you know, the ideology of the Zapatistas, at least on a formal level of their declarations and their speeches and their demands on government after, say, 1994, when the uprising took place, and then in 1995, 96, during the negotiations and peace negotiations and conversations between the Zapatistas and the federal government, it was an argument based on the concept of legitimate historical and violated rights of indigenous peoples by the nation state. I mean, this was the major argument of the Zapatistas regarding the issue of indigenous rights. And they came up with several proposals for constitutional reform, which were not taken up by the government. And that's why the peace negotiations fell apart. And the reform, which finally was adopted by the Mexican Congress several years later in the year 2001, had eliminated some of the points that had been negotiated before previous government and the Zapatistas. So their arguments are very much based on the conception of collective rights of indigenous peoples, and go very much in the sense of the demands of other indigenous groups, both in Mexico and elsewhere, regarding the recognition of collective rights of indigenous people, in the sense of education, of linguistic rights, literacy rights, self-government rights at the local level, and so on and so forth. It's there, it's in the language. Now, people are researching what is actually happening at the local level. I have a student of mine who did a thesis on how the Zapatistas manage their schools, and they seem to apply the concept of indigenous rights in the restructuring of their schools at the local level. But dealings with the government, not officially. The Zapatistas are still saying, we cannot deal with a corrupt government, we cannot deal with a repressive government, we cannot deal with a government that doesn't understand us and that has betrayed us during the peace negotiations, referring back to 95, 96. Yes, sir.
Is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo still valid? Is there a statute of limitation on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo?
I think it's valid. It's there. It's part of reality nowadays. So the Mexicans who live south of that area have been American citizens for many generations now. Maybe there are some indigenous peoples among them. I don't know. Yes, sir.
My question was about the Zapatistas also, and you answered most of it. Just one more thing. Do you think that their movement or what they're doing is a model or could be a model or is going in the direction of a model to solve some of the problems you've been talking about all evening?
Well, certainly in the language you find among the Zapatistas and many of their sympathizers among indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, there is the concept of an alternative model of society, an alternative model of the state, including that. But it doesn't go much further. When people ask and want to find out, well, exactly what does it mean? For example, the conception of autonomy, which is very important. It's even in the UN declaration that I mentioned, you know, Article 3, self-determination, autonomy of indigenous communities. What does it mean? In Mexico, for the time being, it is still sticking to the basic territorial unit of organization, which is the municipio, which is the municipality equivalent, say, to the county in the United States. But the municipio has always, on paper, been free, based on an old concept from feudal times in Spain. The idea that the local communes, you know, have a degree of autonomy and freedom vis-a-vis the feudal lord and the monarch. And this was brought to New Spain, and communities have always struggled in the name of communal freedoms, which perhaps are the basis of our modern conception of human rights, against an authority, a repressive state, which a colonial state certainly was, and which the national state has also become in countries like Mexico and elsewhere. So how do you, in that kind of a state, while it still exists, and it certainly exists in Mexico and elsewhere, what does local autonomy actually mean? The municipio in Mexico has never really been free. It has never been autonomous totally, because it is controlled by the federal state, by an authoritarian federal state, which for 70 years during the 20th century was a one-party state. You know? And so it really decided the lives of the people in these so-called free municipios. And basically because the municipios doesn't have resources of its own. It doesn't have a fiscal structure, except for some few examples. Most municipios are small and poor and lack resources and are overpopulated. And this is certainly happening in the indigenous areas of Mexico. So when the Zapatistas say, we want to reorganize our territorial, local arrangements, political arrangements, with more power to the communities, to the indigenous communities, to the indigenous municipalities, it's a very seductive argument, but nobody really knows how it can be made to work. And I think other countries, Bolivia, for example, at the present time, is facing the same issues. Yes?
So, can you think of any examples of isolated indigenous communities who have been able to benefit from, for example, the 2007 UN, can you think of any examples of, aside from a group like the Zapatistas, just a small group who somehow use some NGO or something like that and can benefit and have benefited from
well, that depends.
Actually, just
I
two other questions. One of them is, have you worked at all with Staunton Lynn? Are you familiar with this work? And the third is, where did you get your name?
Where did I get my name? Oh, well, that's easy. It's an old Aztec name which has been westernized. Believe it or not. Okay. There are not examples of great success based on the adoption of the principles of the Indigenous Human Rights Declaration of the UN of the year 2007. But there are certain issues that indigenous peoples, not only Zapatistas, indigenous peoples and governments have taken up as a basic human right, defending it because it is now in a UN document. And one of them, which is being widely disseminated, is the right for free, prior, and informed consent. What does that mean? It was something that was drafted for the first time 20 years before in a document produced by the International Labor Organization, Convention 169 of the International Labor Organization, ILO, on indigenous and tribal peoples. The ILO, as you know, is one of the specialized agencies of the UN system. Therefore, it doesn't have the same status as the UN as a whole. But on the other hand, Convention 169 is a treaty, and therefore it is considered to be more of hard international law than the soft international law of the UN Declaration. But that's something that's open to discussion. But the concept of free, prior, and informed consent means that governments should not undertake any action that may affect the lives, the future circumstances of survival and so forth, or the will and the subjective perception of indigenous peoples anywhere in the world by actions like building a dam, which I mentioned before in the case of Brazil, and which happens all over the place, or any kind of economic decision or other kinds of policy decisions that indigenous peoples are not prior informed about and consulted about and consented to. And this has caused a tsunami among indigenous peoples. It's, like a tidal wave. It goes all over the place. You can reach any community in the world of indigenous peoples and they will bring out and say, we have the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And this government is not complying. And so they take their governments to court, which is a lengthy and not a very good process because it is very involved, it's very costly, and indigenous peoples don't have the ability to do it. But in some cases they do, and in some cases they're successful. If they find a sympathetic judge, a sympathetic court, or a sympathetic Supreme Court, as for example the Mayas in Belize have done about a land issue problem before the Inter-American Court, and the Supreme Court has supported that in Belize. So there are cases where, in fact, these rights are, which are on paper in the documents, are now coming to be part of everyday practice. They're not always being implemented by the authorities. That would be too much to ask, a change of heart, everybody, because there's a UN document, come on. We know that doesn't happen. But the indigenous peoples can take this up, and not only as a flag in their demands and complaints and requests, but also as a legal instrument. They can say before a court, our government signed this declaration in the UN, or signed the ILO convention, which is a few years earlier. Now we demand that our government comply with that before the national courts. And this is being brought forward step by step, so that is one of the examples. Another example might be found in the educational system, where the nation state for years and generations has applied the single model education. One language, one curriculum, one educational system fits all. And the indigenous peoples are saying, now wait a minute, we have a right to our language, we have a right to our culture, we have a right to being taught in our languages by teachers prepared who know our community, and slowly this is penetrating national educational systems in many countries, and so there are a number of examples.
Rodolfo, we have worked you hard this evening. Before everybody scatters, I want to remind people to come back next Wednesday for part 2 and an opportunity for more questions, and to return 2 weeks from now where a lavish reception will be held. Part 3.